The human explorer had spent his entire life roaming the stars, famous for his wit and knack for surviving impossible situations. When his ship landed on a remote planet inhabited by the Zanari, an alien species notorious for their ancient and bizarre customs, he hadn't expected his next adventure to be quite so, well, hands-on. The Zanari had enslaved the women of their own race, keeping them chained as part of a centuries-old tradition that supposedly protected them from some mysterious cosmic force. No one knew the truth behind this belief, but it didn't matter to the human. All he knew was that when he saw a young alien woman shackled and helpless, it sparked something in him, a desire to do what he did best: break chains, both physical and metaphorical. Of course, his crew had warned him against getting involved. They said the Zanari wouldn't take kindly to anyone interfering with their customs. But he didn't care. He had his reasons for acting on impulse, reasons that involved being the hero he'd always imagined himself to be. The alien girl was immediately resistant. As he cut through her chains, she gave him a glare that could melt steel. "I didn't ask for your help, human," she said with venom in her voice, her alien eyes narrowing. "Well, that's not how I do things," he quipped, offering her a half-grin. "You're free now. Don't say I never gave you anything." She scoffed, pushing herself up from the ground where she had collapsed after the chains fell away. "I was fine before you showed up, human. I didn't need saving." He shrugged, clearly unfazed. "Well, you've got a funny way of showing it," she grunted, trying to brush herself off, but he could tell she wasn't entirely sure how to deal with her newfound freedom. The chains had held her, yes, but they had also shaped her life in a way she was now uncertain about. "Where will you go now?" he asked, sensing a hesitation in her. "None of your business," she retorted, still angry, still defiant. Yet, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her voice. She didn't know where to turn, and he could see it. "Look, I've got a ship. You're welcome to come with me until you figure it out," he offered, his tone casual but sincere. "I'm not asking for a lifetime commitment. Just, some company on a long ride through space. Could be fun." Her eyes narrowed again, sizing him up, but she didn't move to leave. He hadn't expected her to, really. She was independent, fierce, and most of all, not someone who could easily be manipulated. That was part of what made her fascinating to him. "I'm not your prisoner, human," she finally said, turning her back to him. "Who said anything about prisoners?" he replied with a wink. "I'm offering you the option of freedom. Think of it as a vacation." Her brow furrowed. "A vacation?" "Yeah," he said, stepping a little closer, lowering his voice. "You're free to go wherever you want. But you're also free to stay. I promise I'm not a bad guy." She chuckled bitterly, glancing over her shoulder. "Funny. You look like the bad guy who just stole a slave." He laughed, shaking his head. "I think you've got me all wrong. I didn't steal anything. I liberated you. Big difference." She didn't answer, but her stance relaxed slightly. Maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to consider his offer. Once aboard the ship, things didn't go much smoother. The alien girl didn't want to talk much, and the human wasn't exactly known for his delicate conversational skills. Instead, he filled the silence with jokes and light-hearted comments, trying to break through her cool exterior. But it wasn't until they reached the ship's common quarters that things really started to get interesting. "Don't you think it's a little cramped in here?" she asked, looking around the room, unimpressed. "Better than being stuck in chains, right?" he shot back, raising an eyebrow. She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Her interest seemed piqued now, but she wasn't willing to admit it. There was something undeniably magnetic about the way he didn't give up, no matter how many sarcastic remarks she threw his way. "So," he began casually, flopping onto a couch, "what's it like being, I don't know, free? I mean, being in chains, you get used to that kind of thing, don't you?" She frowned, clearly not thrilled with the topic. "You have no idea what it's like to be bound to something. To someone. Well, I'm not your someone," he quipped, flashing her a mischievous grin. "Just here to show you the ropes, so to speak." She stared at him for a moment, completely deadpan. Don't even try it. He chuckled, leaning back further on the couch. It's okay, I get it. You're not ready to admit it yet. You're trapped in your own idea of freedom. At that, she finally cracked a smile, albeit a reluctant one. You're infuriating. He shrugged, standing up. Guess I have that effect on people. He then started toward the door, but not before adding, I'll leave you to get comfortable. Just remember, freedom means you don't have to stay in here. But hey, if you're stuck, you can always join me for some real freedom. The way he said it, half teasing, half serious, lingered in the air like a challenge. For a moment, the alien girl hesitated, caught in the gravity of his words, before finally letting out a frustrated sigh. She didn't want to admit it, but the human had cracked something in her. Something she hadn't even known was there. Don't get too comfortable, human. I'm not your prisoner, she muttered, even though the look in her eyes betrayed her. She was starting to wonder if, perhaps, freedom didn't always have to mean alone. The human leaned against the doorframe, watching her carefully, not sure if he was testing her patience or if she was testing his. The silence between them was becoming a game. Who would crack first? I'm not going back to them, she said abruptly, turning away from him. Her voice was quieter this time, tinged with something he couldn't quite place. Then what? You're just gonna stay here? He raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her sudden shift in tone. I don't know yet, she muttered, her gaze flicking to the small window, staring out into the endless void of space. You don't get it, do you? I get that you're stubborn, and I get that you're trying to prove something, he said, stepping closer, watching her closely. But what's the point of being free if you don't know what you're doing with it? She whirled around, glaring at him. You don't understand. You're free because you've never been trapped. Her words were sharp, but there was a vulnerability hiding just beneath. Trapped? He smirked, raising both hands in mock surrender. I'm not the one who had literal chains on me. Her eyes narrowed. You think that's the only kind of trap? He chuckled, the tension in the air thickening. I think you've been living in those chains for so long you forgot what it's like to be free. Don't worry, I can help with that. She snorted, shaking her head. You're unbelievable. I'm not the one who's trapped, he said with a wink. You're free to stay or leave. Your call. She stared at him, speechless for a moment. Then she gave him a short, frustrated sigh. Fine. I'll stay. But just because you're right. I don't know where to go next. Good choice, he said, stepping forward. Freedom's about choice, right? Just remember, freedom means no chains. Her gaze flicked to the bed in the corner of the room, and then back to him. I'm not getting into that bed, if that's what you're implying. His grin widened, but he held his ground. I didn't say anything about the bed. Just a suggestion if you're tired. You've got the freedom to do whatever you want, no chains, remember? Her eyes sparkled with a mix of defiance and intrigue. You're trying to play me. But I won't be the one caught in your trap. His lips twitched with amusement. A little late for that. You've already trapped yourself in this situation, haven't you? Don't flatter yourself. She shot back, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her expression. The heat in the air between them was undeniable now, and she wasn't sure how to deal with it. I'm not flattered. I'm just stating facts, he said, voice soft but laced with humor. You're not the only one who's been stuck in situations they didn't want to be in. She didn't respond at first, staring at the floor. The quiet stretched on for several moments before she spoke again, quieter this time. You don't get it. I didn't want to be freed. I didn't want anyone to think I needed saving. You didn't ask for it. But that doesn't mean you didn't need it, he said, his tone shifting slightly, softer but still firm. You think you were fine, but you weren't. You were stuck in a system that kept you trapped. Chains or no chains. Her breath hitched, her eyes narrowing. What's your point, human? My point is... He stepped a little closer, leaning against the wall next to her. Sometimes we need someone to help us realize we don't have to keep ourselves locked up in those cages. I wasn't locked up, she said quickly, but it lacked conviction. I wasn't. But you were, he interrupted gently, his voice calm but firm. And you're still trying to convince yourself you weren't. She froze, the truth of his words settling into her bones. There was a weight to it, one she couldn't deny. She wasn't used to facing her own vulnerabilities, especially not from someone else's perspective. So now what? She muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Now? He shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Now you realize you've got choices. You're not trapped anymore. You don't have to stay locked in your head either. Her eyes flickered toward him. I don't need you to lecture me on freedom. I'm not lecturing, he said smoothly. I'm offering you the freedom to make your own decisions. You can't be trapped unless you let yourself be. That's the truth, and I think you know it. She huffed, crossing her arms, unsure how to respond. The entire dynamic between them had shifted, subtly, but undeniably. They weren't just two strangers anymore. There was something else in the air, something more than just humor and teasing. I'm not staying here forever, she said, her voice tinged with something softer now. I don't know how long I'll stick around. Don't have to, he said, voice still light, but with an edge that let her know he wasn't going to push her. But when you do decide what to do with your freedom, it's yours. No chains. She nodded, feeling a strange mix of warmth and discomfort at his words. She wasn't sure if she was ready to embrace this freedom fully, or him. But I will warn you, he continued with a grin. If you end up stuck, I'll probably be the one to find a way out. She raised an eyebrow. What makes you so sure? He leaned in, his voice low, teasing. Because I'm really good at getting people out of tight situations. She couldn't help but laugh, the tension between them finally cracking. You're impossible. Impossible? Nah. Just free, he said with a wink. And free people don't play by the rules. You'll figure that out soon enough. The air between them had shifted once more, but this time, it wasn't tense or charged. It was comfortable, almost playful. And for the first time since her chains had been cut, the alien girl didn't feel so alone. Maybe freedom wasn't about being completely on her own. Maybe it was about knowing that, for once, someone cared enough to help her find her way out. The silence between them had stretched to the point where it felt less like tension and more like comfort. The human's nonchalant confidence had a calming effect, but the alien girl wasn't ready to admit it. She folded her arms tightly across her chest, clearly trying to maintain some semblance of control. I'm not your captive, you know, she said, eyes narrowed, though the words lacked the usual edge. Who said anything about captivity? He shot back, lounging comfortably on the couch. I don't do chains, sweetheart. Just freedom. She snorted, though a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Is that what you tell every girl you rescue? Only the ones who really need rescuing. He winked, clearly amused by the playful banter. Her eyes glinted with something mischievous. And what makes you think I need rescuing? Because you're sitting here, aren't you? He motioned to the small space they shared. You're stuck here, just like me. And I'm not talking about this room. I'm talking about your mind. You're still locked up in there. She stiffened, her posture defensive. You don't know anything about me. He leaned forward slightly, his tone softening just a bit. I know more than you think. You're a fighter. I get that. But it doesn't mean you have to keep fighting everything. The alien girl scoffed, standing up abruptly and pacing to the other side of the room. You humans are all the same. You think you can just talk your way into someone's head, convince them that they need to change. He chuckled, watching her as she moved. I'm not trying to change you. I'm just trying to get you to see that maybe there's a better way than staying locked in the past. You think I want this? She motioned to herself. To be stuck with you, taking up space in your bed? He looked up from the couch, eyes twinkling with mischief. I'm not the one stuck in the bed. You're the one keeping yourself trapped in that chair, just waiting for something to happen. You're already halfway there. Her eyes narrowed dangerously. You think you know everything, don't you? Only about freedom, he said, his grin wide. And you're still learning the ropes. But hey, that's part of being free, right? There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Just doing what works for you. She stood still for a moment, staring at him, then shook her head, clearly frustrated. I don't want to be another one of your projects. I didn't ask for your help. I didn't ask for your pity. Who said anything about pity? He sat up, his voice casual but steady. I don't do pity. I do freedom, and if you don't want to take it, that's fine. But I'm still here. No chains, no strings attached. Her gaze softened ever so slightly. I don't know how to be free. I don't know what that even looks like. He smiled, standing up and walking over to her. It's not about knowing what it looks like. It's about deciding to take it. Whatever it is for you. Whether that's staying here with me, or finding your way out. The alien girl shook her head, a quiet laugh escaping her lips. You really think you've got it all figured out, don't you? I don't have it figured out, he replied with a shrug. But I know enough to say that you're not trapped here unless you want to be. This place? This ship? It's just a room. Nothing more. She met his gaze, eyes searching, but there was something deeper there. And what happens if I leave? Then you leave, he said, his voice unexpectedly tender. But you won't be leaving because you're running away. You'll be leaving because you're choosing to walk away. That's the difference between freedom and chains. The alien girl was quiet for a long while, contemplating his words. The fight was draining out of her slowly, like sand slipping through an open hand. Maybe you're right, she said softly, her voice less certain than before. Maybe I don't know what it means to be free. Maybe I never did. He didn't answer immediately, instead giving her a space to breathe, to think, to make her own decision. Freedom isn't about perfection, he finally said. It's about not being afraid to choose. She turned away, her back to him. I don't want to be that person, the one who needs saving. I'm not trying to save you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm just offering you a way out. The alien girl stayed silent, her arms folding tightly across her chest again. I don't know if I'm ready for that. You don't have to be, he said, his tone softening even more. You'll know when you are. She turned back to face him, eyes filled with emotion. You're not what I expected. He raised an eyebrow, smirking. You thought I'd be some kind of knight in shining armor? No, she said with a small smile. I thought you'd be more of a trophy hunter. He laughed, the sound genuine and warm. You really think that low of me? Maybe not that low, she said, her expression softening. But you definitely aren't what I expected. Good, he replied, walking closer to her, closing the gap that had been there for so long. Because I'm not here to be what you expect. I'm here to be what you need, whenever that is. The words lingered between them, heavy with meaning, and for a moment, she felt something she hadn't expected, the weight of connection. She'd come from a life of isolation, of chains, both physical and emotional. But now, in the quiet of this small room, she felt as though she had a choice. She could leave, run, and continue the life she'd always known, or she could step into a new kind of freedom, a freedom that was hers to take, hers to define. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel afraid of what came next. The tension in the air had shifted again, but this time, it felt less like a battle and more like a quiet understanding. The alien girl wasn't sure what was happening to her. She had been locked in chains for so long, physically and emotionally, that freedom felt almost like a foreign concept. But the human, this confident, persistent, undeniably charming human, was making her rethink everything she knew about what it meant to be free. She stood by the window, staring out at the stars, her mind racing with thoughts she didn't want to confront. You know, you're right about one thing, she said without turning to him. I've been stuck. But it wasn't just the chains. It was me. I didn't know how to get out of it. The human didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just waited, like he knew she needed time to say it. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, more vulnerable than she had ever allowed herself to sound. I thought that if I stayed in control, If I never let anyone in, I could keep the chains from wrapping around me again. But I was wrong. The chains, they were inside me the whole time. He walked toward her slowly, his presence calm but assertive. You've been through a lot, more than anyone should have to go through. But you don't need to keep holding on to the past. Not anymore. She felt the words sink in deeper than she had expected. His simple statement cut through the walls she had built, walls she had thought would protect her from ever feeling exposed again. And what now? I'm supposed to just forget everything and, move on? No, he said gently. Not forget. Just, not let it control you anymore. You're not bound by anything anymore. You don't have to keep fighting yourself. She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. Sounds easier said than done. Well, nothing worth having comes easy, he said with a shrug, his tone light but not dismissive. But I'm not asking you to do it alone. I'm here, and if you want to keep fighting, I'll be right by your side. There was a long pause before she turned to face him, the weight of his words settling over her. She had always been independent, too independent for her own good. But now, for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she had to do everything on her own. You're not like anyone I've ever met, she said, the words surprising even herself. I thought you'd just be another hero with an agenda. But you're different. He grinned. I'm glad you noticed. I'm not here to save you. I'm here to offer you the space to save yourself. No strings, no games. Just freedom. For a moment, the weight in her chest eased. It wasn't perfect, and she wasn't naive enough to think it would be. But there was something in the human's words that resonated with her, something that allowed her to finally breathe again. But that doesn't mean I'm staying here forever, she said, though her voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. Of course not, he replied easily. You've got your own journey to figure out. I'm not here to keep you from it. Just make sure you don't forget that you're free to make the choices that are right for you. She stared at him, taking in the easy confidence in his face, the way his smile wasn't smug, but genuine. And you're okay with that? With me leaving? I'm okay with whatever you need to do, he said simply. But just so you know, if you decide to stick around, I'll be here. No expectations, no pressure. It was exactly what she had needed to hear, something simple, straightforward, and completely free of obligation. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't being cornered into a decision. The human wasn't asking for her to become something she wasn't. He was offering her the space to be exactly who she was. She looked down at the floor, her mind drifting back to the past, the days spent in chains, the hours lost in captivity, both physical and mental. But now, all of it seemed so distant, like someone else's life. I'm not used to having choices, she admitted, her voice soft. That's what freedom is, right? He said, his voice warm. Choices. You don't have to know exactly what comes next. But you've got the freedom to figure it out. She smiled faintly, feeling a weight lift off her chest. She didn't have to have all the answers. She didn't have to figure everything out right away. For the first time, she realized it was okay to just be, without constantly worrying about what was coming next. You know, she said, her tone lightening, you're a real pain in the ass sometimes. He chuckled, clearly pleased. I'll take that as a compliment. She stepped closer to him, looking up at him with a mix of curiosity and challenge in her eyes. I don't know if I'll ever be able to completely let go of everything, but maybe I don't need to. That's right, he said, meeting her gaze with the same steady warmth. You don't need to. Just don't let it control you. And if you ever want to talk about it. She raised a hand, cutting him off. I think I've heard enough speeches for one lifetime. He laughed again, stepping aside to let her pass. Fair enough. I'll let you get some rest. But just remember, if you change your mind, I'm here. She walked past him, then paused just before reaching the door to her quarters. Without turning around, she said, You might just be the most frustrating person I've ever met. And yet you keep coming back. He called after her, the humor evident in his voice. She didn't respond immediately, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't angry. She wasn't irritated. She felt lighter. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to realize that freedom wasn't just about escaping the chains. It was about learning how to live beyond them, step by step. And for the first time, she wasn't doing it alone. Yeah, she said softly, as if to herself. Maybe I'll stick around for a while. And just like that, the walls she had built around herself, walls made of old fears, old pain, began to crumble. Slowly. But surely.